There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll sure shake your windows and rattle your walls. But the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of MindShift Podcast. This week I am super happy to be bringing you just a really insightful and challenging, thought-provoking conversation that I had with author Sheri Pallas. And she is the author of a book that's going to be coming out at some point here called Man Has Ruined God, My Journey Out of Religion and Into the Arms of God. And the way she describes the book on her website is basically, she says it's partly a memoir, partly it's a narrative. Really, it's all about what I learned, she says, as I left religion and found unconditional love. And that's the title of this episode today. Has humanity ruined God? Well, what do you think? I think certainly from a historical point of view, we can make a pretty strong case that throughout the history of the church, we can see many, many examples of where the church has done this type of thing in terms of co-opting the Bible, co-opting Jesus, and possibly God as well. Certainly salvation. I mean, just one example, look at what happened in the Reformation with Martin Luther. He was angry that they were selling salvation. Basically, the church was selling indulgences, selling people on this concept of purgatory, using God, using their reading of the Bible, which of course the Catholic Church tightly controlled. They controlled the reading, the interpretation of those sacred scriptures. And because they were in control of that interpretation, they of course could tell people exactly what it meant and what it meant for their lives. And having that authority, that authoritative text and authoritative interpretation provided the Catholic Church with an absolutely golden opportunity to manipulate and control people. And certainly we've seen examples like this all throughout the church's history. And so this is the question that I want to tackle with Sheri today in this episode. How exactly does she think humanity has ruined God, and what's the alternative? Because if you notice the title of the book, she talks about leaving religion, but coming back into what she calls love with a capital L, and finding out what is God, who is God, what is it all about. And so this might prove to be a helpful conversation for you too, if you're in this journey of deconstructing your beliefs, your former beliefs, if you're a former fundamentalist, evangelical Christian, whatever religious background you come out of, where do you go from here? And I think for a lot of people, perhaps like myself, like Sheri, and in fact, we're going to get into some of her backstory coming out of a fundamentalist background and what that did to her and how that affected her in so many ways. I think though, when we come out of that, we find ourselves wanting to wall off that kind of spiritual side of things. But I don't think that's a very healthy move, because we know that for sure humanity needs spirituality in our lives. It's an important component of who we are in terms of a holistic view of ourselves. There's an element of spirituality. Now, the question is, what does that spirituality look like? Is it a toxic form, like so many of us have experienced in evangelicalism or fundamentalism or other religions? And so where do we go from here? How can we learn to integrate that spirituality piece into our lives in healthy ways, though? And really, something that I want to press Sheri on, we get into this in this episode, is what exactly does it look like in the real world, in real terms? Can it make us a better, more loving person? All the things, ironically, that the church promised that we were going to become: more accepting, more loving, more forgiving, a better person, whatever that means. But as we know, in so many cases, it's exactly the opposite in this rules-based sort of legalistic system that so much of evangelicalism and the church has devolved into. And I think this is part of what Sheri's talking about by saying humanity has ruined God, co-opting the Bible, co-opting Christianity and God for their own ends. It's all about patriarchy and control and all these other kind of elements that we see so much of the time. And again, I say historically too, this is a long litany of examples we could pull up to show how this has taken place. So I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation with Sheri Pallas, which I'm going to be bringing you in just a minute. I just wanted to mention real quickly before we get into the talk with Sheri that we have a couple new Patreon supporters for MindShift Podcast, and I wanted to give a shout out to Bill Runzel as well as to Kelly Clampett. Thank you for supporting MindShift Podcast. If you want to be a part of supporting this show, that would be great. Some of the benefits that you get as a supporter are early releases. I tend to release these episodes on Wednesday, so you don't have to wait till Friday to get these episodes. Another thing that I'm doing is I'm adding a new online video course, and I'm putting up one episode a month, and this will be available on Patreon as well. It's called Reconstruction After Deconstruction. I've already done one video. You can check that out. That's also on the MindShift Podcast YouTube channel, as well as on Patreon. It's kind of an overview of what the course is going to be about, and I'm working on the next video already now, so that's going to be coming out probably sometime in November. So I'm really excited about doing that course. I've had some great feedback just on the introductory video. So if you want to find out what this course is going to be about, then take a look either on YouTube or Patreon. Okay, so we got the business out of the way. Let's go on into the conversation that I had with Sheri Pallas, and I'd be very interested to hear what your thoughts and comments and feedback are on this subject. Do you agree with Sheri? Has humanity indeed ruined God? Thank you for being on MindShift Podcast, Sheri.
Thank you for having me.
As we were talking before we started recording, I think that's how we set this whole thing up. Was I actually started a thread on ex-evangelical about spanking, and we went back and forth on that, and that's what led to us doing this podcast recording now. Isn't that kind of what happened? I think that's how it went down.
Exactly.
Yeah, because we were talking about our shared experiences growing up in a fundamentalist home, being spanked, well, let's just say abused, really, by a parent who believed they were doing all the right things according to the Bible and according to the church's teaching, what that has done to us emotionally, psychologically, sexuality, all kinds of things. So I thought we need to do a podcast. This is too good to kind of waste this opportunity. So I'm really glad to be talking to you about all this stuff. This is going to be really good.
Who would have thought that the beatings would have brought us together?
The spankings brought us together. Well, you are also an author. You have written a book, and you do write on Medium as well. Well, can you tell us what's the title of your book?
The book is titled Man Has Ruined God, My Journey Out of Religion and Into the Arms of God.
Yes, and we're going to get into that a little bit later in this show. We're going to talk about your book because, I mean, it's just fascinating to hear another person's story of how they got away. But in your case, and we mentioned this a little bit before we started recording, you have a view of God. Obviously, I mean, look at the title of your book. You went away from God but came back to God, but it's not the same God that you of fundamentalism or evangelicalism, not by a long shot, is it?
No. I no longer believe in God of the Bible. I think that being, in quotes, is very sadistic, angry, and someone that, frankly, I don't want to be around. I try to avoid people like the being that they paint in the evangelical church of what God seems to be.
Yeah.
And I went on a journey to say there's got to be more.
Because a lot of people do go down different paths for sure. This is something I've done a lot of research and studying and talking to ex-evangelical people. They go all the way from people that want to reform the church from without or within, and they're really passionate about it. I mean, that was me for a long time. But then there's people who become angry atheists, angry theists, or just totally don't want to have anything to do with church and God, or they're just agnostic, they don't know. But there's a segment of people that have been able to retain a view of God, albeit a radically different version of that, like you say, that evangelical or fundamentalist God. So this is something we definitely need to get into, but I'm thinking what would be interesting is to hear your story. Can you tell us a little bit about your story growing up and your experiences in evangelicalism, if not fundamentalism?
Sure. I come from an interesting and probably unique background. My parents split up when I was 2, and they went in dramatically different directions. My father became a drug-dealing criminal who was once nominated to be the Grand Dragon of the KKK in the Northern California division. My mom, on the other hand, went to the evangelical church. I was saved when I was 6, and she became full-on fanatical, speaking in tongues, burning books and records, and condemning anyone who did not hold her views of Jesus, the Bible, and the church. She blew more people out of her life than she ever had in it because of the disagreements, and I was one of those. I was one of the people that she called a heathen and kicked out of her life. She prayed for the demise of my relationships. My father did too, but in a different way because he was a racist and I married a black guy.
Oh, that would piss him off.
My mom was glad he wasn't born a bastard, and my dad went off into a total different realm and actually wanted to kill my baby at one point.
Wow, that is
But I
unbelievable.
escaped all of that and decided to find my own way because I knew there was a truth somewhere. I knew that there was some truth in some things, and I had to find that. I had to find out if there was a truth in a different religion, in science, wherever it went. I had to find that, and that journey brought on this book.
That's where you came to write the book. Were you actually raised then in fundamentalism by your mother? Because, as you say, your parents split up. I mean, I don't know how in the world they ever got together in the first place, but this is unbelievable. That's a crazy story.
People ask
there.
that all the time. Yes, it was brief.
A brief affair.
I went to a Christian school from 2nd until 10th grade, and church 5 times a week, Bible studies at the house, pastor always over. We changed churches, which was really tough on me because we went from a small Assemblies of God situation into a mass, church with 10,000 people. So the cliques were even bigger, the separation was even worse, and it was total tribalism. Judgment, what are you wearing, what do you sound like, are you talking to the right people? And I just stood there like, what are you guys doing? Even at a young age, I just wanted to be accepted that they said that God did. But I never saw that anywhere.
You saw the exact opposite.
Everybody was always doing the opposite of what they said.
Exactly. That is what's so bizarre about this whole thing. I picked up on 2 pieces that you've just shared already. One of them is that even though they told us when we were Christians that you're supposed to be evangelizing everybody around you, your mother drove people away from her, including you. And so that's the opposite of what a good Christian's supposed to do. And then the other thing is, as you say, the church is supposed to be open and loving and welcoming and a beautiful community and a fellowship. And they promised us all those things. I remember hearing it, and I remember saying it myself when I was a pastor. But yet the exact opposite. We hear gossip and backstabbing and slander and vicious rumors flying around in church politics and the cliques and all this bullshit. And you're going, what does this have to do with anything related to what I thought Jesus was supposed to be about? So yeah, it's a major, major cognitive dissonance going on. There's got to be.
Well, and my mom would say with tears in her eyes and a heavy heart that I was affecting her chance of heaven. Her friends were challenging her faith by just being promiscuous or going out and having a drink. And so being around these people affected her salvation, and so she couldn't do it. And I looked at her pleading as a child. I was 15, 16 years old, and she's throwing me out of the house and saying, how could God want this? How could God tell a mother to abandon their daughter? And she said, get out.
Just booted you out.
So, yeah, I mean, it was a power struggle. It was, at that point, it was like, screw you and your God and everything around it. I don't want any part of this. Why would I want to worship and praise and give my life to a God that would be like this? I wasn't even throwing wild parties.
You didn't get to that till later. Well, this is a major problem, and I've recently come to see this as well. Something that David Hayward, the Naked Pastor, in our podcast, he said there's 2 pieces, or at least 2 pieces, to a person's deconstruction. One of them is deconstructing their relationship with the church, and you've got to go through that whole piece. The other piece is deconstructing our theological belief system. And that is another big element because, as you say, one thing is walking away from the church and saying, I don't want to deal with all the politics and all the crap that's going on, the way I'm being treated. But then when you start actually breaking down what you believed in God, that's a huge piece, I think. And it's a lot of people don't do that, or they can't seem to get there because it's really threatening. There's a social cost to be paid for both of them, for sure, isn't there?
There is, but everything is a contradiction in terms. The Old Testament contradicts the New Testament. And, current beliefs contradict what Jesus said. So when you take any type of fundamentalist attitude or any type of condemnation, you're always going to end up a hypocrite. And that's what the church and my mother and everything I saw, because regardless of what Jesus said, they were taking it as a form of power. And when you invoke power and religion is when everybody suffers. When someone says that my way, that this is my interpretation of the Bible and everybody else around it is wrong, that person is going to turn out to be a hypocrite, because there's going to be something in the Bible that contradicts what they say anyway.
You're going to find it somewhere.
So if you based your religion on anything other than kindness, grace, and love, you're going to fail. The control is what has caused religion to fail. As soon as man said, oh my God, I can use this power of love and acceptance to get what I want, I can make more money, I can get more power, I can get people to follow me, that's what failed. And that's what Jesus came to rail against. I mean, that's what he tossed tables. He fought the religious elite. And yet evangelicals are doing the exact same thing that Jesus railed against the religious elite for doing, just in different words and different times. It's the same thing. So whenever someone says, well, according to the Bible, I guarantee you I can find something else according to the Bible that will contradict that. The Bible is just full of it.
Exactly. And the fact is that whenever someone says, well, the Bible says X, Y, Z, what they really mean is what I think the Bible says is X, Y, Z. Exactly. They're interpreting it. So it's filtered through a lens of presuppositions and theological biases and all kinds of experiences and on and on and on. So there's no such thing as a straight reading of the biblical text. That's just not possible. We all have our biases and our presuppositions. So it's interesting to me because I studied preaching for a long time. That's what I did my PhD in, was homiletics and preaching. And so I broke down the dynamics of preaching and how it actually works in terms of communication strategies. And that's one of the things that led to my deconstruction, was that as I was sitting in church, I was analyzing the sermons from a sort of a rhetorical point of view as well as a hermeneutical point of view. So I'm going, man, I've got all kinds of problems with all of this, what this person's saying, how they're saying it, what they're doing. And I'm like, I got to get out of here. I can't take it anymore. So academics help get me out.
And I think the people that actually go through the deconstruction are people that have gone through the pain of the cognitive dissonance.
Oh, yes.
I mean, a lot of people start feeling that and run and hide and bury themselves in and say, I won't go there again. The Bible said, don't allow any thoughts into my head. I have to cleanse my thoughts. And then the people who actually go through the deconstruction go, okay, what the fuck?
Exactly.
What are we going to do here? What is going on? Let me find this out. And those are the two categories. And whatever emotions come from that, I think, is where people land on the whole spectrum of beliefs at this point.
The cognitive dissonance is such a problem, and yet what we see people doing within evangelicalism or even liberal Christianity, they double down a lot of times. Rather than face the cognitive dissonance, they think, okay, what I have to do is actually dig in even deeper and just sort of defend it at all costs, and it becomes a serious problem because, then they're putting the blinders on purposely. They just can't live with the cognitive dissonance. So I'll just deny it and I'll dig in, I'll double down, and you can't even have a conversation with someone like that.
And that's what the whole book is me going through the cognitive dissonance and being like, okay, where do we go from here? One of the prime examples was my chapter on homosexuality. I had, in my summaries and in my outlines, I was all planning on doing the do not cast your seed upon the rocks, the stones, quote verse, and even wrote like 3 or 4 pages into the chapter and then went to go check some sources so I could cite everything and realized that verse doesn't even exist. The premise of everything that I had heard against homosexuality isn't even in the Bible. It's about this whole other story about this guy having to have sex with his dead brother's wife. I mean, a total cluster of miscommunication and misinformation. And I'm 4 pages into a chapter, and I'm like, oh, my God, what do I do? And I called a friend of mine, and he actually said, well, you need to change the quote facts then. You find everything that will fit into your narrative so you can continue on with your narrative. And I was like, wait, no, that's the whole reason I'm here, is to find the truth, not to continue some narrative, not to continue the bullshit, not to continue all of this rhetoric that ruins people's lives. I want to know the truth. And that is, so I scrapped everything I had written and actually wrote that as the opening is, this chapter was the epitome of my cognitive dissonance because I had everything planned on what I was going to write. I thought I solved the problem and knew exactly where the Bible screwed up, and even that was wrong.
Even that was
wrong. I still stood by my point. But, yeah, it's tough. It's not an easy thing to go through. I understand why people go, I'd rather not.
It's very threatening. It's very scary because it was our very identity, our worldview, everything. I've said many times before, I spent my entire adult life has been spent either in education preparing for ministry or then in ministry itself and then teaching. So I've spent the last 20 plus years in and around service to the church. I've walked away 10, 11 years ago now. But I spent most of my adult life I've spent in service to the church. So that's not something you take lightly. I've given up my whole adult life. And now I'm walking away. I've got, in a sense, nothing to show for it. I don't have a career. I don't have a job. I don't have anything. I've lost everything that I once had. But I'm not going back into the system. There's no way. No way.
No, exactly.
Never go back.
Exactly.
So how
Doesn't it all boil down to ego? Because once the ego gets flared with the cognitive dissonance and you say, oh, my God, I have to admit that I was wrong. I have to admit that what I learned was wrong or the people I loved informed me wrong. And not until we can admit that the information that we processed, accepted, believed, all of that is wrong, can we even get through it. I think that's the hardest thing. And the ego works in different ways because it can tell you that you're a piece of shit or it can tell you that you're the greatest. Either way, it's, working towards the benefit of it. And when something says, well, you're wrong and you need to accept that, is what scares most people. And that's when they go, no, I can't accept that, and I'm going to stand firm in my beliefs or my faith that there is some righteousness, there is something right about this somehow, some way.
Those people that taught us, they weren't. I think most of them, or all of them, probably. They weren't intentionally trying to deceive us. I don't think that, and that's what's so insidious about the whole thing. Were well-meaning, well-intended people who they think they're doing the right thing, and that's the whole thing, isn't it? Is that they believe. Why were our parents spanking us till we cried? Because they were told by a pastor. In my case, it was the Bill Gothard seminars and all that this was what God intends for parents to do. This is God's will. You have to spank a child till he or she cries, and what you're actually doing is you're breaking their proclivity to sin, and you're helping the child, guide them in the paths of righteousness. So they're doing all the right things for all the right reasons. But, of course, the end result is we ended up getting abused and traumatized and messed up in so many ways, but they were only doing what they thought was the right thing. They were told this is what God wants.
And that was also part of the process, was to realize that, to accept that, and to forgive. Because, as a child incurring this, being abandoned, being abused, all of those things in the name of God, it makes you turn away from everything, the people that you love and the God and everything. But when you realize that someone, in my mom's case, I know my mom loved me. She had her own issues. She had her own, all of that. She was human just like us all. But I saw the pain and the fear, the to the core fear that she had over my soul. Debilitating, like there was a monster at her door, and she pleaded and said, please, please, please come back to God. You will burn in hell and I will never see you again. And every cell of her body was terrified.
Oh, absolutely.
So how can you blame someone for their actions in that circumstance when they really think that they are doing the right thing and trying to save your soul from eternity? It's not even 60, 70 years like we had. They say eternity. You're going to be burning in hell if you do one of these so-called sins that have changed so many times over the years. One of the biggest chapters in the book is on sin. And it was amazing to me of what we consider sinful today was not considered then, and vice versa.
Exactly right.
And what the true definitions of the sins were. And so those are even subjective. they're punishing and demising people over it.
You could go back to the Reformation times and you could have a prepaid sin. Whoever thought of that, I think it was the Father Tetzel, wasn't it? I want to go sleep with a prostitute tomorrow night so I can prepay for my sin tonight at the church and I'll be forgiven ahead of time. It's a beautiful system. So why not do the indulgence system and selling salvation and all the rest of it, purgatory and everything else? I mean, yeah, what they considered heretical back then, we would laugh at today, and probably they'd consider us heretics for some things that we might believe today. So who's to say who had it right? How did you end up getting out of this system then? I mean, we kind of left your story. It sounds like you were a rebellious teen for sure. But then how did you end up getting out? Because, one of the things that I was talking about with my wife the other day was that when I was such a rebellious kid and my parents were spanking me and beating me all the time, they never said, why is this child acting out? What's going on in his life that would cause him to act in such, naughty and rebellious ways? Because my family was being torn apart at the time, and it was such a toxic environment. I guess I was acting out, to gain attention and to be, to be heard and seen. But their response was just to spank me 5, 6, 7 times a day for several years. That's what we went through. So it sounds like you had a similar kind of backstory there.
Well, and one of the things that was uncovered in the spanking thread was that I wasn't spanked because I was sinning. I was spanked for being who I was.
Exactly.
I was spanked because I talked too much in class. So if I said something to my neighbor, then I was sent to the office and spanked. Or I was humiliated in front of the classroom and brought up to the front of the classroom and spanked. And so any time that I was spanked at school, then I was spanked at home.
So you got a double whammy.
Literally a double whammy.
Literally.
And it wasn't because of, quote, sin. It was because of who I am. And that is where the trauma lies. That is where, it goes, okay, you are actually punishing me for the way that the God you claim made me. And how is that right?
This is
how
so
is
messed
that
up.
loving? And that is really traumatizing. But the final straw for me, I stayed out of the church for a while. I really pushed my son into going. He kind of stopped wanting to go when the church said that Pokemon was satanic. That started his deconstruction.
Wait, you mean
but
Pokemon's
even
not
still,
satanic?
a couple years later, he wanted to be a pastor and all of that. And then it came to the point where he had a child outside of wedlock also.
Uh-oh.
And I contacted the church, and because the mother wanted to do a dedication. And the church, in no short of words, told me no. They would not pray over my grandson because he was born in sin and his parents weren't married.
Oh, you got to be kidding me.
So that was actually the precipice for the book. That's where the book came, because I sent an email to that church like I had never written before.
A blistering email.
Blasting their hypocrisy, blasting their judgment, saying, how dare you? Did Jesus ask for only holy children when he prayed for them? And just said, this is horrendous. And that was the precipice for the book. That's I was like, I'm not putting up with this shit anymore. This is ridiculous.
I've had enough, and I'm gonna go on a tear. I'm gonna write this book. Yeah, you just had enough. But you can imagine, though, isn't it? I mean, going back to your point about how I think you might have said on the thread that my parents were trying to suppress what made me me, and that is such a huge piece, because that thread really it really opened up a lot of stuff in my thoughts and my psyche too. And I started thinking, yeah, you're so right. This stuff, it messed us up on such a deep level. And then you get triggered by experiences like you had with this church, and I think sometimes those experiences, or maybe our anger and our emotions, kind of even shock us sometimes. And think, whoa, where did that come from? What's this about? I've got to go in here and now deal with this whole piece. So you wrote this book. That was your response to, I guess, dealing with this final outrage that you had from this church.
I had never even written a complaint letter before.
You weren't the ranting, angry customer?
The conversation happened when I was at work, and I stewed on it all day. So by the time I was driving home, I was irate.
Yeah, you were hot.
And when I sent that email off, it was like It was my proclamation.
Yeah.
Like, no, I'm not dealing with this anymore. I'm not dealing with the bigotry and the hatred and the ignorance. This is ridiculous. And consequently, the next day after she received my email, she called me and said, well, I spoke with the pastor, and we will make a concession for you.
Right.
But we will do it after the Wednesday night service. We will not allow you in front of our congregation.
Oh,
and that
very
was their
condescending.
appeasement. And my son and his wife, well, they got married later, but his girlfriend at the time were driving from Virginia. I mean, they were going to make a 10-hour trip to have this service and everything. And this was the response from the church. And the church that he grew up in also said that Pokemon was satanic.
It wasn't like he was a stranger to them. They knew who he was.
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah. And the thing is in evangelicalism, they're so picky about stuff like this. Because I can remember when I was in Bible college, I was in a pastoral ministry class, and we got into this discussion. The teacher threw out a subject. He said, what would you do if you were a pastor of a church and an unmarried couple, a couple that was living together, came to you and said, kind of a similar scenario, we have a child and we want to get married, would you do it if they weren't Christians? And it was such a bit, we actually had a huge argument over this whole, and some people said, no, I would not marry them because they're not Christians and they're not members of our church. And that's the kind of distinctions they're willing to draw. And yet, look at the emotional, the psychological damage on someone like yourself, someone like your son. What message does that send to other people looking on from the outside? What the hell's going on in there? They can be that judgmental.
I would really like to hear of Jesus' words where he ever once said anything like that.
Where did he say that?
He healed the centurion slave boy, which was known at the time of being his gay partner. He spoke with the Samaritan woman. I mean, he did everything that is the antithesis of what they teach now. In fact, I even float a theory that, we have been waiting for 2,000 years for the Antichrist. We've been waiting for a single person to come and say, okay, this is what this is. When in actuality, we're actually seeing it right now, because there is nothing more Antichrist than what we're seeing in the evangelical church. It is Antichrist to block people from coming and talking. It is Antichrist to put conditions on love. So while there may not be some, with the way we've envisioned and Hollywood has done, and Dante and all of that, of the evil Antichrist, what these people are doing now cannot be any more Antichrist, because that's not what Christ was about. There's some other people in the Bible who, you can put that on. But don't call yourself a Christian if you're going to be discriminating about who you love and who you talk to. Talking
to a friend of mine the other day, he was saying that, he asks people when they tell him that they're Christians, he says, you know what, that's wonderful, I'm happy for you. He says, I just have a couple questions, though. Tell me specifically, give me specific examples from your life. How do you specifically live according to the teachings of Jesus? Can you give me 3 or 4 just real specific? And that's when things start to break down. He says, every Christian I ever encounter, they love to talk about abstract ideas, God and love and community and forgiveness and faith and all these Christian words. But when you start pushing them to give me specifics, how this actually is consistent with the methods and message of Jesus, they cannot do it. And he says, the reason I don't go to church anymore is because I'm not prepared to put up with the bullshit. And that's exactly why he walked away, the same as you.
I'll tell you what, my Facebook book page has been up for 3 years. The anniversary was 2 or 3 days ago. And in the 3 years that I have found, and I've been on that page and working it, nothing gets people more upset than when I have to tell them that they have to love their gay neighbor their Muslim neighbor, and that Muslim, Jews, and Christians all worship the same God. People go, absolutely ballistic. They go apeshit and go, nuts. No, I don't have to love my gay neighbor because God says that they're an abomination. No, Muslims don't worship the same God because they call them Allah and not God. As soon as you tell someone, look, you're supposed to love everyone and actually list it out, it amazes me, the rage that comes from those statements.
Oh, yeah.
It absolutely amazes me. And it's no, there's no buts. There's no buts. There's never, no, everyone.
If you run a Christian bake shop, you don't have to bake a cake for a transgender person or a gay person either. And that's what God would want you to do, is not bake them a cake. So that's been another high-profile thing in America, isn't it? It's just crazy the way evangelicals can be so hateful and divisive, and we're going, what does this have to do with this Jesus that you claim to serve? I'm failing to see the connection. Exactly. I'm seeing a massive disconnect.
Well, and I think one of the things that is probably unique to evangelicals is that other people affect their salvation. So the baker said that, if he were to bake a cake for the, gay couple or transgender, that affected his salvation.
How is that possible?
And I don't understand that either. That's what my mom used to say. At one point she stopped being friends with her very best friend in the world because she got a boyfriend. And so that meant that this friend was having sex.
Oh,
and she screamed at me and said, "You better get a hold of Diana because you two are going to meet each other in Armageddon."
She actually said that to you. Wow. What the hell? Really?
What? I mean,
where does this come from?
They think that these people who are outside of their circle are jeopardizing their chance at heaven. And I don't understand the logic in that at all. I mean, you're responsible for your own sins. You're responsible for your own life. And how, demeaning someone else's, I mean, if anything, that would affect your place in heaven, right? If there is a God and we get to heaven and God's going to say, "How did you love?" And, "Oh, no, God, I didn't love those people."
Not those gays and Muslims and Buddhists and whatever.
Yeah, not those, yeah.
Well, and I've said it many times before, this is the ultimate irony that the good news of salvation as proclaimed by these evangelicals isn't actually good news at all. In fact, it's terribly bad news, because if you just plug in your piece, what you just said, Christians who are afraid that someone else will affect their salvation, that's not good news. If what I do is going to affect you going to heaven or hell, that's got to produce a lot of anxiety and stress in you. And then there's also always the fear that I could lose my salvation too for something I personally did. And so Christians are stressed and worried about that too. So this is not good news. This is very, very bad news, and it produces all kinds of trauma in terms of psychologically, emotionally, and depression, PTSD. I mean, there's a laundry list of issues that Christians have because of stuff like this. It's a crazy system. It really is.
I would say for a solid 20 years, I was actively on defense for how God was going to punish me. I was told that whenever I did anything wrong, then I would be punished. So I was waking up each morning full of anxiety, wondering, is how I'm going to be punished? As soon as something, mildly went wrong, oh, here's my punishment. Here we go.
This is it.
Which, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy is what it is, because you set yourself up and you put yourself out there in such a negative environment of all of this anxiety and stress and fear that you're actually bringing all of this onto you. And the moment I went, whoa, wait, I am not, undeserving. I am worthy. I am whole. I'm not this, all of these pieces that need to be put together like, a flower that's just, fallen apart. Everything changed. Bad things stopped happening to me. I mean, it was crazy. As soon as I stopped expecting to be, cast into the lake of fire, I no longer felt like I was.
The other aspect to this is when things are going really well, we think the opposite is happening, that God is blessing us. So when things are going good, we're getting blessed, but there's still the anxiety that if I screw up, that I'm going to get punished. So, even in the good times, I can remember having this conversation with my wife. When things were going well, she would say something like that. She'd say, well, we have to enjoy it while it lasts, but we have to temper our expectations, kind of a thing, where probably something bad's going to happen pretty soon, because this good times can't last forever. God's going to punish us for doing something wrong, something from our past or whatever it might be. Imagine having to live in that with that kind of a complex going on all the time. It's just absurd.
Well, and it also prevented my mother from supporting me in any way.
Well, how could she?
Because if something was going wrong, I would call her, I would be upset, and it would be, well, you shouldn't have sinned.
Yep, this is your punishment.
Well, you made this life. Hey, Mom, my son needs some food. I'm really struggling here. God will provide. God will provide.
Just trust Him, have faith.
And it's like, you don't think that God put you here to help me?
Yeah, what
I
about
mean,
just,
isn't that what we're all here, is to help each other in the lack of a presence of God?
yeah, on a
You know,
human level?
the onus is on us. I mean, onus is like the perfect word because it's literally on us.
Exactly.
And when we take the being, the human, the God that is matter out of the situation and make it more of an energy that we can tap into and we can guide, then that actually enables us to be there for people. That says, you know what, I'm going to tap into this love, and that's going to give me the strength to be there for that person. I'm going to tap into this love and say, you know what, I don't agree with what you're doing. I don't agree with what you say, but you need love right now, and that's the only thing that matters, and that's why I'm here.
All we need
That
is
is
love.
what
That's
Jesus
what the song
would have
said.
said. That's what, you know, if there's a God, that's all that should matter. And it's the hardest thing to do ever.
It's so
To
hard.
love is so hard. It has to be godly.
Yeah, love is the
It ain't
greatest force in the
easy.
universe. That's what they say. Well, and that might be a good segue to talk about your book, because going back to this issue of God and retaining some view of God, whatever that may be, we said this at the beginning when we started talking, that we got to get into this, because I'm fascinated by people who have, okay, yes, you've jettisoned the fundamentalist evangelical God, but you've been able to retain something. So what is that God, in air quotes, whatever you want to call it, him, her, I don't know. What is your view of God now, and how is that different from the God of, the past that you used to believe in, that we did?
And through my research, I found my school book was the Bible for the most part. Science, history was the Bible. So when I started doing all of this research, I realized that humans have constructed God into matter, and matter decays and dies. There is no stability in matter whatsoever. But in God as an energy never dies. It just transforms. It continues on. So in order for God not to break his own rules, if there is a God, in order for not to be void against their own rules, God has got to be an energy. And I believe that God is the energy of love. We either tap into it or we don't. We access it or we don't. It has no control over, football games, unless you practice really hard.
Parking spots.
The parking spot, unless one opens up, it's how you bring love into your life. And that, also ties into the free will of either you act in love or you don't. The punishment is not from God. It's from a lack of love in your life. There's been times that I felt really, really lonely, and it was because I didn't have people around that I felt loved. That is what hell is.
You need that support.
When you're tapping into love and you're giving it, that's when we embody God. Not some being sitting in the clouds with a long white beard.
You think God is more like a force, an energy? There's no consequences, though, to not tapping into that force. Unlike, the Christian God, obviously, if you don't believe in him, if you don't follow him and obey him, you're going to end up in hell. Eternal conscious torment in the flames of hell. What's your view of God? How is that different? If in terms of consequences, what do you suffer if you don't tap into that energy?
Well, I think the consequences are kind of given. If you're an asshole, a lot of people don't want to be around you.
Or they elect you as president, maybe. I don't know. That seemed to work.
But I mean, if you're not nice, if you're not kind, there are going to be consequences here on earth for that.
It's just
for
real
every
life
action, there's an
consequences.
opposite and equal reaction. If you abandon someone that you love, then you're going to be lonely. The consequences of not working in love have nothing to do with God. It's just whether or not we tap into that. The consequences of not working in love are being lonely, or being, the thing about love is it crosses all time, era, cultures, geography, everything. And that was one of the things that I really struggled with Jesus, because Jesus could not be the truth if he didn't cross all of those boundaries. So how can Jesus be the only way, the truth, and the life? What about all the people before him? And what about all the people that never heard of him, people in the Amazon? But love, everybody from the moment we're born till the day we die is searching for love. So that makes it, in truth, as truth as much as gravity is, as far as we know. And I think that feeling, and that, when you encounter love, it sets your soul on fire, and you feel alive, and you want to give, and it's the best thing on earth. And that's why we have all these dating websites and everything, so people can feel that feeling. Through my research, I found that tapping into that love is what was capitalized by religion. That feeling, that giving, that wonderful nature is where religion came and grabbed it and said, let's capitalize on this. Let's use this for control. If you step out of bounds of what we have set, then you will lose this love. Taking it from an unconditional energy source of pure, unconditional love to something that held conditions with power and prestige and greed and money. And that's where we screwed it up. The book is, people go, well, what do you mean by man has ruined God? No, it's very literal. I mean it very literally. I don't mean man as far as the sex of man. Yeah. I mean humans.
Humanity.
And we humans have really screwed it up.
Look, for example, at theology, and not just Christian theology. I mean, you could plug in Islamic theology, Jewish theology, Judaism, as well as Christianity. The more we try to quantify who and what we think God is, the more we kind of constrain that. Is that where you kind of see that going off the rails? Because, I mean, you can go back to, let's say, Thomas Aquinas. I remember reading through his Summa Theologica, and I couldn't finish it because it was all these propositions and propositions and propositions proving the existence of God, proving this and proving that. And he had the whole system in such a box. And I think to myself, man, I mean, you talk about ruining God, whatever that is, that can easily do that. And where we have now this very propositional, doctrinal sort of faith, and you got to believe all the right things or you're not going to go to heaven.
Yeah, and I really saw the evolution of it in going through the 613 sins of the Old Testament or the Bible. And
all the laws.
I mean, I could really see the growth of man, and I could envision, okay, we all have to love everybody, no exceptions. And then a week later, someone walks up and goes, but this guy just did this. Okay, let me write a rule that's an exception.
Exactly.
And we get to 613. It's like, I mean, how much more are we trying to quantify God? We do put him in the box of our understanding. We do that with everything, though.
It's human nature.
And one of the things I struggled with, and one of my atheist friends always gets on me, is it's really, really hard not to humanize something like that. I mean, I see faces in the knots in my fence outside. I see faces, it's one of those things that I just do. So being human, it's really difficult. We have to almost go against our instincts to try to not humanize God. And in doing so, I think is the result of all of our failures. I mean, the opening sentence of the book is, the greatest lie ever told was that we were made in the image of God. We made God in the image of us.
Yeah, we've made God in man's image rather than the other way around, as it says in the Bible, supposedly, whatever that means.
Exactly.
And, of course, theologians have argued for forever about what even that means. I can remember teaching a class on theological anthropology, and we spent weeks on this whole subject of what does it mean that humanity was created in the image of God. And we looked at all these theologians, and there was all these different arguments over one little verse in Genesis. So you talk about putting God in a box, man. I mean, one verse.
Yeah.
And what does that even mean? And the volumes and volumes have been written on what even that one little sentence means. It's truly unbelievable. Although maybe it isn't unbelievable because that, as you say, that tends to be human nature. We want to quantify things. We want to explain things and understand them and figure things out. And then we feel secure in ourselves, I think. Okay, I understand this and I've got this down. So now I feel pretty good about where I'm headed and spiritually, and I'm going to heaven and all that.
Well, and I think in the end, while through all of my research and all of the studying I did and growing up, in the end, I have this theory, right? I mean, none of us know anything. So I have this theory that God is actually the energy of love, the energy of creation, all of that. But at the end of the day, it's just a theory. I'm not going to base my life off of this. I'm not going to put my life on the line, rather.
You're not going to start a religion.
I'm not going to, hurt someone else because of this theory. It's a belief because none of us know. It is a belief that I have come to through education, process, thought, elimination, all of these things. So it's, somewhat of an educated theory, but it is still, at the end of the day, a belief. And because of those beliefs, no one else should suffer. And that's where I think that all of it needs to stop. You can have your beliefs, you can do what you want, but the moment that someone else is suffering because of that is when things need to change.
Look at the damage that religion and religionism have caused to humanity over the centuries, the millennia. It is unbelievable.
Oh my God.
The millions of deaths and the torture. I mean, I did a lot of research on the Spanish Inquisition a few years ago, and I mean, the whole thing was motivated by religious fervor and the desire to make sure that there were no secret Jews or secret Muslims in Spain. And this was all to the glory of God, burning people at the stake and torturing them. And how is that somehow resonant with supposedly Christianity? I don't understand that. How you can put people to death, torture them, and with a clear conscience. That's all doing the good work of God. It's unbelievable.
Well, and more people have died in the name of God than all natural disasters combined. And one of the things that I continually bring up in the book is, if God is so powerful and God is omnipotent and so all of these things, why does he require so much of our help?
Yeah, exactly.
Why are we tasked with killing these people if God is so powerful?
Why can't he just do it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why not? Hey, just take them out, God. This is, I will be done. It's all in your hands. Jesus, take the wheel. Hold on, I need to grab my gun and go shoot somebody. Yeah. I mean, it's insane.
It really is.
Again, it's the dichotomy of the faith, the beliefs, and logic. And that was one of the things that I tried to find. It's like, okay, we have to be logical. Everything we know outside of religion is logical. Everything. So if we're going to look at this and try and define God in some way, shape, or form, try to come up with a picture in our brain of what this is, then we have to be equally logical. And totally negating the beliefs, the faith, the construction, the foundation, all of that of what you proclaim God to be, by doing God's work, it just doesn't make any sense to me. Again, it's, the God that they portray as my drunk uncle.
Yeah, the abusive drunk uncle.
Who I just want to send to the corner and go, behave.
It's really true. When you look at the God they've constructed, it is actually a horrifying, abusive, angry, needy, controlling God.
Weak.
Yeah, I mean, I was posting on Twitter the other day that hashtag that got going, hashtag evangelical contributions, and it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek hashtag about what sort of things have evangelicals contributed to the public sphere and all this. And I said, well, look at the narrative that they say that God, when they took prayer out of public schools, I've heard this said by evangelicals, when they took prayer out of public schools, the atheists, Madeline Murray O'Hara, that horrible person, that God actually, like the gentleman that he is, he left the public school sector, and he's gone. And when we bring prayer back, then he'll come back, and that's why there's such things as school shootings and things like that, because God left the public school. We kicked him out, and he left. And someone said, can you tell me how omniscience works again? Because according to your own theology, that's not even possible. How can he's everywhere. So he can't just leave a public school. He can't leave anywhere. He's everywhere. It's absurd. The whole thing doesn't even work. It doesn't even make sense.
It turns God into a 15-year-old schoolgirl who's a bitch and just as crazy because she didn't get invited to the party.
So I'm going to stomp and go home.
It's insane.
Or the kid, I'm going to take my ball and go home. That's the kind of thing, isn't it? You don't want me here, so piss off. I'm going to leave. And then whatever trouble you get into, it's your own damn fault. Because I wasn't there to stop it. So, too bad.
Yeah.
What kind of a God does that? It's crazy. Yeah. It's literally crazy.
It's one that we're supposed to go and worship and give our money to and give our life to. And, I mean, if you take everything that the descriptors and what they say, I don't want any part of it.
That's the problem.
You tell me that something's going to make me a better, more loving, better subjective, so I don't like to use that word, but a more loving person, that I can be graceful in the times of adversity. Teach me how to be kind when someone is unkind to me. Teach me how to be loving when I struggle with acceptance. That is what will make us more like God. Not believe this, say this, do this, follow this. None of that. That's rules. That's regulations. That none of that makes you a more loving person. I mean, think about how difficult love is the next time you're driving in traffic and someone cuts you off.
Yeah.
Or, when when you lose a promotion to someone who you didn't think was worthy of when they got it. Any of the, injustices that we incur every day, or what we view as injustices across our lives, those are the times that we're supposed to be loving, and those are the most difficult times. Nadia Bolz-Weber does a thing in one of her courses where she says that she's going to be sitting between Hitler and Dobson in heaven. And my skin crawled, and I was so upset by that, because I stress in the book, I bet, if there is a heaven, I better not get up there and Hitler be there. Better not happen.
And Dobson.
But then she talked about how that was true grace. And I had never looked at it before, and it was like, you know what? I keep saying unconditional love is unconditional love.
If it's supposed to work.
Greater than us, it's greater than our understandings. Still going to be a bit pissed off if Hitler's there, but I'm sure, whatever. It's beyond our perception.
It is.
Really
it is. How can people get a hold of you? Because we got to talk about what's the best way? Twitter, Facebook, what's the best kind of platform if people want to find you, find your book? Do you have a blog? Do you write any other places?
I've got a website, Medium, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all under Man Has Ruined God. So if you Google search, do anything on any of those platforms, Man Has Ruined God, I will come up. I also want to set something up for the MindShift listeners. So in the next couple days, I will set something up. So go search for Man Has Ruined God /MindShift.
Hey,
I'll be
that's
giving
cool.
something away to you guys.
Well, we're not going to tell you what it is. I don't even know what it is, but you can also catch a bonus conversation that we had before we hit the record button on Patreon as well. So there's some really cool stuff for people who want to support us. And the thing is, this is really important, I think, because what we're doing is in having these kinds of conversations and stuff you write and interacting on Facebook and Twitter and different places, it's empowering people who are struggling. They really are. And this stuff we're not making this shit up. We lived it. We know what we're talking about. I think it's hugely empowering, and it's a healing process as well to come out of all that. The stuff we've been talking about is hugely important. So I'm really glad that you've been kind of opening up and sharing all this stuff with us. Love this conversation. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this has been great. And I think, too, this is something I've been doing a lot lately. I would love to come back in like 6 or 8 months and sort of revisit. So I don't know if you're up for coming back on the show maybe in 6 or 8 months, but we can come back and say, okay, Sheri, what's different in your life? What's changed? Has anything changed? So I don't know if you'd be interested in that, but I would love to have you back here on this podcast if you're up for it.
I would love that. And by then, I will have a publication date for the book. So I can make that announcement at that point, too.
So we can promote your book, because hopefully by then it will be released to the public. But for now, people can follow you on Twitter, and they can also look for your blog where they can find more information about how man has ruined God. So thank you so much, Sheri Pallas, for being a guest on MindShift Podcast.
Thanks so much, Clint. It was a pleasure.
I'm always fascinated to talk to people like Sheri, someone who has deconstructed her former fundamentalist evangelical belief system, but has kind of come back around and has come up with a view of God that she has discovered that works for her. And this is something that I'm absolutely fascinated by. I've talked to a lot of people on this podcast before, like Stacey Ray, Sarah Smith, Josh DeKaiser, some other people who deconstructed their former religious beliefs, but yet have not abandoned that view of God. And now it's a completely different view of God, completely different, absolutely 100% different than, as I say, the God of evangelicalism. Their view of the Bible has changed, and their view of God has consequently changed. And so this is an option for people, obviously, who are looking to deconstruct but are not ready to jettison entirely their view of God. They're not necessarily an agnostic. They haven't gone down the atheist or even angry atheist route. They're still struggling with this. So hopefully this has helped you a little bit to kind of unpack some of your own thinking along this process. Do you still believe in God, and what does that God look like? Is it something, as Sheri described, more of a force, more of an energy of love, and how that's helped her kind of walk through life and be a better person, as she says, be a different person. without all the structures and the strictures of dogma and rules and all the things that come along with so much of religion. And in fact, that's a great segue to talk about next week's episode. I've got a guy that I met while I was in Seattle doing our live podcast. His name's Jimmy Brower. He came all the way up from Eugene, Oregon, which is a long drive, 4 or 5 hour drive, just so he could be a part of the podcast. And I ended up interviewing him about a week or so later as he was coming back home, back down through Seattle on his way home to Eugene. And it's a really fascinating story. I don't want to give too much of it away, but it's really interesting to see how his deconstruction means a lot different than what a lot of ex-evangelicals kind of describe as their journey. So stay tuned for that coming up next Friday with Jimmy Brower. We're going to be talking about how he deconstructed and has, again, like Sheri, been able somehow to retain a view of God, although it's completely different than the one Sheri was articulating in this episode today. I'm going to be very interested to get into this discussion with Jimmy and see how he was able to retain a view of God. Again, though, very, very different than the God of evangelicalism and fundamentalism in which he was raised. So come back next Friday. Join me and Jimmy Brower as we delve into his story. I promise you it's going to be a fascinating discussion that you are not going to want to miss. Now, I want to say real quick before I let you go that whatever your thoughts and comments and feedback are, I'd love to hear them from this episode or really any other episode. You can always get a hold of me on Twitter at MindShift 2018, and other connections are listed as always in the show notes, as well as those for Sheri Pallas if you want to get a hold of her and find out some more information about her upcoming book about how man has ruined God. So thanks for joining me and Sheri Pallas. As always, I have been your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. I will see you next Friday along with Jimmy Brower right here on MindShift Podcast.